Thanks, Mr. Acting Deputy President. I want to add some comments to those that are made this morning, and also recognising that it's likely that the Senate will be debating legislation later this week about the parliamentary approval for a deployment. So I'll reserve my comments on that issue until Thursday, in large part, but just want to add to the contributions of other senators. And I'd like to contrast the spirit in which Senator Dastyari approached the debate to that of the previous speaker. I don't want any of us on any side of this chamber to be put in a position that if you don't agree with a particular speaker, then you're pro-beheading, or that you are pro the kind of vile activities that we see the so-called Islamic State is perpetrating in the areas of which it has control of territory. It's an incredibly degrading way to conduct the debate, and I don't think any of us should descend there. I will note that one of the reasons that we believe that this debate should have been brought forward, and acknowledge that it has been, is that the situation is inordinately complex, and we keep getting put in positions where, in an attempt to help, and I will extend this courtesy to those on the other side of the chamber, because everybody who's lined up has expressed a willingness to try and help, and that's why I think there is such broad support for humanitarian intervention in the areas where we may have some agency to be able to do something. But the line between humanitarian intervention and armed aggression in another part of the world is incredibly fine, and it's actually very difficult to draw that line. We are already seeing the concept of humanitarian assistance ranging from airdrops of food, first aid equipment, water, some of the other materials that Senator Johnson outlined to the Senate earlier in the day, now to provisioning of weapons to groups that Australia in part has listed as a terrorist organisation, the PKK, who are well and truly entrenched in that theatre of war. And the minister was unable to explain earlier how this weaponry will be prevented from falling into the hands of those who Australia has listed as a terrorist organisation. We've gone from humanitarian intervention to drops of weapons by the Royal Australian Air Force from Russia or Eastern Europe, flights that will almost certainly need to be protected by SAS troops, if they're not already there, to either secure the landing areas or secure the flight crews when they arrive. That, as I mentioned this morning, the Pine Gap installation is almost certainly being used to guide drone attacks inside Iraq and perhaps inside Syria. We don't really know. We've already well and truly blurred, and I would argue crossed the line from humanitarian intervention to again being a combatant in this theatre of war. Maybe that is something that those on the other side are completely comfortable with. That's why the Australian Greens believe that not only should these issues be submitted to respectful debate in this place before we commit other people to risk their lives in this part of the world, but indeed that the legislature should be paid the respect so that each of us can line up and record our names on one side of the ledger or another to submit these issues to a vote. It's what the United States Congress does. It's what the British Parliament in Westminster does, by convention, I acknowledge, not by law, but that was what they learned as a result of deep inquiries into the Iraq disaster, and it is what many kindred democracies do elsewhere. Because, and listening very carefully to Prime Minister Abbott's words at his press conference yesterday and other comments to Parliament today, that this is being done with the consent of the Iraqi government, I wondered at the time, and I think others did as well, why the Iraqi ambassador was not present at that announcement, why there was no statement that I'm aware of anyway from Iraqi officials here in Australia. It turns out while this debate has been unfolding, the ambassador has been conducting an interview with David Spears on Sky News and has warned against doing what we've done and has said the arms shipments should go through the central Iraqi authorities and not be supplied to the Peshmerga. I'll have to go back and see exactly what their statement is, but it appears on our reading that they weren't even notified of the terms of Australia's intervention, where we slipped from humanitarian supplies of food and other essentials to light arms. Now the Iraqi authorities here are saying, well, if we were going to drop weapons into Victoria, we would probably consult Canberra first. What exactly have you got us into? And these are the kind of questions that need to be thoroughly ventilated in this place. Because the Australian government is so determined to take its lead from the United States, on undertakings that are never made public until many, many years after these engagements. I thought it might perhaps be worth, and again, listening to Prime Minister Abbott's comments very carefully, he had said there is no intention to put Australian boots on the ground. That's what President Obama has said, as though our foreign and defence policy is being guided entirely by decisions taken in the White House. No other sovereign country does that. Nobody does that. It's something that appears to have uniquely evolved here in Australia. And I believe, and I'll have more to say about this on Thursday, that that is the reason why parliamentarians in this place from the major parties would refuse to submit a vote to Parliament on any given deployment, no matter how meritorious, because it would prevent these kind of blank cheques being written to the United States government. I suspect you would find, as has obviously been made clear by Senators Wong and Conroy this morning, that the deployment is strongly supported by the ALP. It means that vote would be carried. It would be carried in the House of Representatives and would be carried in the Senate. It's not that the government's objectives would necessarily be put at risk, but you'd have to stand up and justify them. Because Prime Minister Abbott appears to have made undertakings to the President of the US, to what looks to us like an open-ended commitment, I think it's worth looking to some of the more moderate voices in the US defence and national security establishment about how this debate is playing out in the United States, where, unlike Australia, the invasion of Iraq came at extraordinary cost in US lives, and it goes without saying, or it has gone largely without saying, extraordinary cost in Iraqi lives. Joe Cirincione is one analyst whose views I think should be more widely considered here in Australia. This is something that he wrote in 2004 under the general principle of first do no harm. In 2004, he wrote the following: "It was almost inevitable that a US victory would add to the sense of cultural, ethnic and religious humiliation that is known to be a prime motivator of al-Qaeda-type terrorists." This is written in the context of President George Bush's infamous mission accomplished stunt on the deck of a US aircraft carrier that I think has continued to resonate. Mr Cirincione continues, "It was widely predicted by experts beforehand that the war would boost recruitment to this network and deepen anti-Americanism in a region already deeply antagonistic to the United States and suspicious of its motives. Although this may not be the ultimate outcome, the latter has so far been a clear cost of the war. And while a successful war would definitely eliminate a rogue state, it might and may also create a new failed state, one that cannot control its borders, provide internal security or deliver basic services to its people. Arguably, such failed states like Afghanistan, Sudan and others pose the greatest risk in the long struggle against terror." I read that, and that's 10 years ago this year that was written, and thought he has more or less accurately predicted the collapse of that part of Iraq into effectively what could develop into a full-blown civil war, and the establishment of a terror state where none existed before. Chas Freeman Jr., who's a former US diplomat, writes more recently, only this past July, in an article called "Obama's Foreign Policy and the Future of the Middle East." He says, "To begin, if we are at all honest, we must admit that the deplorable state of affairs in the Middle East, in Egypt, Iraq, Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine, Syria, Iran, the Persian Gulf and Arabian Peninsula, and peripherally Afghanistan, is a product not only of the dynamics of the region, but also of a lapse in our capacity to think and act strategically." In other words, there are voices, wiser voices that we have heard largely in the Australian context, in the United States, cautioning very strongly against further open-ended military commitment to this part of the world, partly because it may well make things worse, to give credibility and increase that sense of isolation and attack by foreign powers on an organisation like the Islamic State, rather than letting their neighbours, who by and large utterly loathe the existence of this new creation, may in fact be the very thing that consolidates them and allows them to continue their recruiting. And that there are voices in the Australian foreign and defence policy establishment who I think have been quite compelling, running the argument that in fact this may be exactly what they're after, that it plays to their narrative, that again, this is precisely the kind of reason why these measures should be subjected to full debate that is respectful, rather than simply hurling abuse across the chamber.
Thank you, Senator.